When the new handler arrived, no one stopped what they were doing. The clatter of boots and the hum of containment door swallowed her quiet steps. She looked ordinary to ordinary for the research ward, where every newcomer was measured by how loud they spoke or how heavy their stride fell. Her boots made no sound, her hair was tied back in a plain knot, and the badge on her chest held no rank marks, only the symbol of civilian clearance, which meant she was no one worth saluting. She walked past the observation glass where the predator cubs paced, restless and wary. They were not small, not really their bodies, rippled with muscle even at half growth, and the shine in their eyes hinted at something more than animal, more than training. They were born from projects no one spoke of out loud, shaped from human design and wild memory, the kind of creatures that decided for themselves whether they would listen or tear a throat open. The other handlers watched her with the usual mix of boredom and disdain. Someone whispered that she was temporary, another said she would quit in a week. One she saw what real predators looked like, and one of them laughed, saying she did not even carry a tranquilizer gun. What did she think she would do? Charm them into obedience? But she did not answer. She only paused by the reinforced glass as one of the cubs approached. Its head low, eyes sharp as molten gold. They said the cubs did not feel affection. They said these things could sense fear better than heat, and yet the cub pressed its muzzle against the glass and stayed still. The woman leaned slightly closer, her eyes steady, her face calm, not smiling, but soft, in a way that did not belong to this place of alarms and steel. The cub tilted its head, and a strange sound came from its throat, something between a hum and a growl. It made the guard on duty step back, his finger brushing the trigger of his dart rifle, but she only whispered a word too quiet for the microphone to catch, and the cub sat down, as if understanding her completely. The senior handler cleared his throat and told her not to engage with unbonded specimens, but she seemed not to hear him, or perhaps she did, and simply chose not to obey. She stood there a while longer, her hand hovering just above the glass, as if feeling for something invisible, before she turned and walked away without a word. That night the recording logs showed an anomaly, an enclosure to the cub that had pressed to the glass, refused food, refused rest. It kept pacing the same line where she had stood until the lights dimmed and silence fell across the ward. Even then, its gaze stayed fixed on the door, as if waiting for her to return. No one noticed how the other cubs had stopped their usual fighting, how they too had gone quiet, as if something had shifted in the air, some unspoken recognition passing through the pack, something they felt before any human could name it. They called them predator cubs, but no one who had ever stood near their enclosures truly believed they were young. Their muscles moved like coiled storms beneath their sleek hides, and their eyes carried the weight of something ancient, something that had seen more than it should have in so short a life. Yet, to the human who arrived without rank or weapon, they were simply restless creatures caught between instinct and confusion. Each morning she entered the lower observation hall with the same quiet stride, her steps soft against the cold metal floor, the air thick with the scent of sterilizers, and the low pulse of containment fields around her. The others watched from the upper decks, noting how the cubs followed her without sound, their movements slow, deliberate, their gazes fixed as though they were waiting for a signal no one else could see. One of the technicians joked that the cubs must sense her fear and were toying with her before deciding to strike. Another laughed, but their laughter faded when the smallest of the group pressed its paw against the barrier glass mirror. In the motion of her hand as she traced the surface, her eyes met its golden stare, and something unspoken passed between them, not defiance, not dominance, but recognition. No one could explain it later. The logs captured no unusual readings, no change in the containment energy, no vocalization. Yet every person in that hall felt the air tighten for a moment, as if the facility itself held its breath. When she spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. Her words carried no authority, but the tone of them reached the cubs in a way that command never did. The growling stopped, the pacing slowed. Their ears turned toward her, as though the sound of her voice reached places deep inside their minds where fear and fury were born. The lead handler shouted through the intercom, telling her to maintain distance protocol, but she ignored him. Her attention fixed on the young creature before her, it tilted its head low, its breath fogging the glass, and when she placed her palm against that faint patch of warmth, the cub closed its eyes for the first time since capture, its body easing as if finally safe. Later, when the shifts changed and she was gone, the other handlers tried to repeat her calm approach. They They used her tone, her stillness, but the cubs reacted with hostility, snapping at the glass, thrashing in their cells as though rejecting the imitation. The staff marked it down as behavioral instability. They told themselves that the creatures were unpredictable, that nothing unusual had happened, but those who had been there knew something had shifted. Something subtle and irreversible. The cubs no longer looked at them as threats or caretakers. They looked toward the door, waiting for her return, the nameless handler without badge or file whose presence carried a gravity no one could define. And in the quiet hours between shifts, when the lights dimmed and the hum of machines softened the small cub would lie against the edge of its pen, staring through the glass, whispering low sounds at the night guards. Swore were not growls, but something that sounded almost like words. The third morning came, wrapped in a heavy quiet, the kind that made even the guards speak in low voices as though the air itself might shatter if disturbed. The cubs were restless, their pacing sharper, their growls edged with unease. Something unseen pulsed through the corridors of the containment wing, a low hum that set teeth on edge, but the human did not change. Her pace, she entered as she always did, calm, steady, eyes soft but unwavering. The technicians glanced at each other when the monitors flickered. Static rippled across the screens for a heartbeat, then cleared, and one of the containment doors showed an error code, red and blinking, the smallest cub enclosure to the one that had pressed to her hand 2 days before the lock failed. The door hissed open, chaos erupted, alarms wailed, and lights flashed red across the ceiling. The senior handler shouted for security to fall back, but she did not move. She stood in the middle of the hall while the cub stepped through the misting doorway, muscles taut years back, eyes burning with confusion and fear. It had never known freedom within walls, and now the sound and light drove it wildly. Soldiers lifted their dart rifles. Their orders came sharp and cold: shoot to sedate Manome. Exposure. She raised her hand, but no one saw it in the red haze. She began to walk forward, slow as if through water. Every step measured. The cub snarled, its claws striking sparks on the floor, and the handler at the console screamed for her to stop. But she kept moving, her face unreadable, her breath steady in the chaos. The cub lunged forward, not at her but at the sound behind her, a guard fumbling his weapon. She reached it before he could fire. Her hand brushed its shoulder, a motion so small it should have meant nothing, but the beast froze mid-strike, its head turning toward her, eyes wide with something like recognition. She whispered something the microphones did not catch, the sound too soft, too human. The cub lowered its head, a tremor passing through its body as the alarm lights flashed across its fur. The others watched in stunned silence. The tranquilizer teams held their fire. The senior handler cursed under his breath, demanding to know what she had done. She ignored him, her hand still resting on the creature's shoulder. She looked not triumphant, not afraid, just very tired, as though the moment had cost her more than anyone could see. When the emergency locks finally sealed and the system stabilized, the cub followed her back into its pen willingly, its claws clicking softly against the steel, its head brushing her arm as it passed through the threshold. The door closed behind it, and the hall fell silent again. No one spoke for a long time. The guards looked at her as though seeing something new, something they could not explain. The cub lay down inside, its pen eyes half closed, body calm for the first time since capture, and when she turned to leave, no one dared to stop her. Even the alarms seemed hesitant to sound against her. Quite the facility ran on protocol and silence, but after the breach nothing felt the same. The alarms had been silenced, yet the echo of them hung in the air like a memory that refused to fade. She returned to her quarters that night without speaking to anyone. Her boots left faint prints of dust on the corridor floor, the same color as the ash that gathered in corners from the recycled air. She did not sleep. She sat by the small reinforced window, looking out at the dim lights of the containment wing, and somewhere beyond the hum of machines she thought she could hear the faint rumble of the cubs breathing in unison. Morning came without ceremony. She walked back through the checkpoint. The guards looked away, pretending to be busy, but their eyes followed her every step. She carried no weapon, no tools, just the same quiet composure that made everyone else uneasy. She passed the observation glass, and the cub, the one that had broken free, lifted its head, its golden eyes bright in the artificial light. It made a low sound, deep and soft, not a growl, not quite a call, more like a greeting. She entered the enclosure before anyone could stop her. The door sealed behind her with a hiss. The air inside smelled of heat and metal. Her breath caught once, but she moved forward, steady hands loose at her sides. The cub watched her from across the space, its tail twitching, its body tensed halfway between trust and Cameras caught every detail, the slight tremor in the creature's flank, the shimmer of sweat on her palms, but the sound was what caught the technicians off guard. She spoke again, words too soft to register on the mics, and the cub answered not in language but in a sound shaped by recognition. She extended her hand, palm open. The cub hesitated, its pupils wide, then took one step forward, another and another, until its nose brushed her finger. She did not flinch even when its breath came hot against her skin. The creature's heart beat so loud it seemed to fill the whole enclosure. Then slowly it lowered its head, pressing its muzzle against her arm the way a frightened child seeks the warmth of a familiar presence. The technicians at the control desk froze. One of them whispered that it was impossible, but no one moved to intervene. Her other hand rose and touched the thick fur along its neck. It trembled not from fear but from something deeper, a release of tension, so sharp it felt alive. The cub leaned closer, its body curling slightly around her legs. She closed her eyes for a moment, her lips moving soundlessly. When she stepped back, the cub followed until the boundary light turned red and the field shimmered again. It sat just behind it, watching as she left, its tail sweeping the floor in slow arcs outside the room. No one met her eyes. The lead handler muttered something about luck and anomalies, but his voice shook. The scientists replayed the footage in silence. No one could explain why the creature obeyed her, why it had chosen calm over chaos. That night the logs showed the cub did not sleep. It stayed awake the entire cycle, its gaze fixed on the door, waiting for her return. Days passed in a rhythm no one could understand. The human arrived each morning at the same hour without fail, moving through the hall with that strange quiet grace that made the cubs still their movements before she even reached their enclosure. The staff began to schedule her access at different times, hoping to catch the creatures off guard, but it never mattered. The moment she stepped into their presence, the air changed. The sharp electric tension that usually filled the cages dissolved into something calm, like the silence that follows a storm. The smallest cub was no longer hostile. It ate only when she was near it, slept only when her footsteps passed outside its enclosure, and when she spoke even from behind the glass. The cub listened, its head tilted, its eyes tracking her voice like a compass locked on a single direction. The technicians marked it as abnormal dependency. The senior handler called it a behavioral glitch, but no one could ignore that the other cubs had begun to mirror it. One morning, the power flickered through the wing, a brief outage caused by the storm. Outside, the containment fields fell for less than a second, but that second was enough to make hearts stop. The cubs did not attack, they did not run, they only turned toward her, their bodies poised but waiting, their focus absolute. The guards lifted their rifles, yet she raised her hand and whispered something too faint for the recorders. The cubs lowered themselves to the floor all at once, as if commanded by a force that was not force at all. When the power returned, the commander demanded an explanation. She gave none. Her report was blank. Under the section labeled verbal command input, she simply wrote observationstablesubject.com. No threat. The man scowled, saying she had broken 3 protocols and endangered staff, but when she met his eyes, he faltered, his mouth still moving but his voice gone thin as paper. She did not argue. She never argued. She only said, the cubs are not weapons, they are waiting. That night the surveillance team caught something strange. The smallest cub pacing the edge of its cell, humming a low rhythm, not quite a growl, not quite a sound that belonged to any known species, and within minutes the other cubs joined it, their tones blending in layers until the whole ward vibrated with that deep pulsing hum. It was not aggression, it was communication, and when she entered the next morning it stopped instantly, every creature turning to face her in silence. The staff began to whisper about her behind closed doors. They said she must have been part of the early rank experiments, the ones rumored to create handlers who could speak to predator minds. Some said she was dangerous, some said she was a savior. No one dared to ask her directly. She did not offer an answer. But when the lights dimmed and the corridors fell quiet, the youngest cub pressed its head to the glass once more and whispered the sound, faint but clear to anyone listening. A soft broken word that sounded like hers. The air in the facility grew heavier each day. The staff could feel it, though no one dared to speak of it out loud. The cubs had changed their patterns of rest and movement. They no longer fought among themselves, no longer lashed out at handlers or cameras. Instead, they waited, they watched, and every time she entered the hole, their hearts beat in unison. The monitors recorded the rhythm, faint but unmistakable, like an echo shared between bodies. The senior handler tried to reassert control. He ordered the lights brightened to maximum. He had the cubs restrained for examination, but the moment the clamps touched their skin, their bodies tensed, eyes flaring gold, and they began to emit that same deep, hum that made the walls vibrate. The hum rose until instruments failed. The technicians covered their ears in panic, and the handler shouted for sedatives, but she stepped forward through the noise, and the moment her voice joined the sound, everything stopped. It was as if silence itself obeyed her. The hum broke, the machines flickered, and the cubs went still, breathing slow and calm. She said only one sentence, the words lost in the static, but whatever she spoke made the handler pale. He ordered her out of the room, yet his voice trembled, and the guards who stood nearby did not move. She left quietly without protest, her face unreadable, her eyes shadowed with something that was not fear but resignation. Rumors spread through the upper levels, faster than data reports. Some claimed she was not human, that she carried the genetic markers of the first Bond project, the one the council had buried after it ended in disaster. Others said she was the last survivor of the rank handlers, a program meant to control predator intelligence through shared empathy, an idea abandoned when empathy proved stronger than command would ever. The truth was, the evidence kept building. The cubs no longer responded to commands from anyone else. Even tranquilizers worked slower around them, as though the chemicals lost power in their presence. And still she came every morning. Still she spoke to them in that quiet voice that turned chaos to calm. The commander returned to the observation deck to see for himself. He stood behind the glass, his eyes narrowed as she entered the pen with the largest cub, the one known for breaking containment locks during storms. It watched her approach, then lowered its head without hesitation. She placed her hand on its muzzle and leaned close, whispering something that made the creature rumble softly, a sound that rippled through the other enclosures like a signet. The commander turned away, his face hard but his hands shaking. He said she was a risk to the entire project. He said she should be transferred before control was lost, but the senior scientists argued that what she did was impossible, that removing her might trigger something none of them could contain. That night, the facility lights flickered once more, and in the dark, between pulses of power, the cubs raised their heads together and their eyes glowed like embers. And deep within the hall, her name drifted in a sound not human but shaped like longing, and none of the guards who heard it slept again. By the seventh day, the silence in the facility had turned brittle. Every step echoed too loud, every breath seemed to carry weight. The cubs had grown restless again, though not violent. They paced in slow circles, their eyes flicking to the entry door as though they knew something was coming, and in a way they did, because word had spread that the commander was returning, not to observe this time but to end ites. Arrived before dawn, his uniform sharp, his metals catching the sterile light of the corridor. He brought with him a squad of armed guards and a scientist. None of them spoke as they moved through the hall. The sound of boots heavy against the floor, the air colder than usual, the technicians standing aside watching from behind consoles, their hands shaking though they tried to hide it. The human stood at the far end of the enclosure corridor waiting for them, her posture calm, her gaze fixed not on the commander but on the cubs behind the glass. The largest one pressed close to the Barryites, golden eyes bright and alert. The commander stopped a few paces away, his mouth a hard line, his voice clipped as he told her she was relieved of duty, effective immediately. He said her methods were unregulated, her influence unnatural. He said no one was permitted to hold control over military-bred predators without clearance. She listened without blinking, and when he finished she asked quietly what clearance meant to him. He frowned as if the question insulted him. He lifted a small tablet and displayed the command order: authorization to terminate all test subjects. If control failed, authorization signed by the upper council itself. She looked at the glowing text, then back at him, her eyes steady, her hands still at her sides. He said if she refused to comply they would handle it themselves. He turned to give the order. Before the words left his mouth, the cubs began to move, not with violence but with eerie precision, their bodies low, their gazes fixed on her. The hum started again, deep and rhythmic, rising from their throats. The glass trembled. The lights flickered. She raised one hand slowly and the hum faded like mist dispersing in sunlight. The commander shouted for the guards to fire, but their fingers froze their weapons, heavy as though dragged down by unseen weight. She stepped closer to him, her voice soft but clear. She said, "You think command is given by rank, but they know better." And the commander stared at her, unable to respond, because for a moment he could see it in her eyes, that reflection not of fear but of something vast, something that did not belong entirely to the human world behind her. The smallest cub pressed its paw to the glass, its gaze fixed on her alone, and the others followed until the entire row of enclosures glowed with faint light from their eyes. The commander stumbled back, whispering that it was impossible, but no one moved to help him. They all just watched as she turned away, and the cubs went still again. That night the footage was sealed, classified under a code no one could trace, but everyone who had been there remembered the sound of her voice in the quiet way the wild had listened. The order came at midnight, whispered through encrypted lines, that the experiment was to be concluded before sunrise. No explanations, no debate. The commander moved through the dark halls with the grim purpose of someone who already knew he had lost but refused to admit it. He found her in the observation chamber, standing alone before the glass, her reflection soft and still, the cubs behind the barrier, lying awake, their eyes faintly glowing like scattered stars in a mechanical scheme. Told her it was over. He said the council wanted proof that she could not control what they had created. He said that whatever connection she had with the creatures ended tonight. She did not answer. Her gaze stayed on the smallest cub, the one that had escaped, the one that now stood watching her with quiet intensity. The commander gestured to his soldiers. They brought the largest cub out into the central pen, its breath fogging in the cold air, its claws scraping faintly against the metal floor. The handlers loaded tranquilizer rifles. The hum of machinery rose. The cub's pulse appeared on the monitors, spiking higher with each second. But she did not move. She only stepped forward until she was at the edge of the safety line, her voice low, barely above the drone of power lines. She said, "Do not do this." And something in her tone made the youngest soldier hesitate, his rifle trembling, but the commander barked an order and the sound cracked through the hall like a shot, though no weapon had yet fired. The cub sensed danger. It reared its head, muscles tightening, its eyes shifting from confusion to rage, but before it could move she crossed the line. The alarm screamed, the guards shouted. She walked into the pen, calm as a shadow. The beast lunged, half in defense, half in terror, and then it froze. Mid-leap, her hand raised, not in command, not in fear, but in recognition. Her voice cut through the chaos, a whisper that did not belong to any language on record. The cub landed hard, its claws scraping the floor, but it did not strike. It lowered itself until its head touched the ground, and the sound that left its throat was not a growl, but something softer, something like surrender. The commander stared, unable to breathe. He tried to speak, but his voice vanished, swallowed by the quiet. She reached out and laid her hand on the creature's head, her palms steady, her expression unreadable, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath behind her. The other cubs rose, pressing their bodies against the glass, their eyes wide. The air thrummed with silent energy, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The monitors overloaded one by one, their screens washing out in white light, and in the center of it all the largest cub lifted its gaze to her and spoke words that none of them had ever imagined to hear from a predator. Its voice, rough, uncertain, almost human. "Can I be yours now?" it said, and in that instant everything stopped. The soldiers, the alarms, even the lights themselves seemed to dim, leaving only the sound of her breath and the quiet devotion of the wild bowing to her. For a long moment no one moved. The hall was still. The lights flickered softly against the pale steel walls, and in that silence the question lingered, heavy and alive. "Can I be yours?" Now the cub had spoken, not through the artificial translators, not through mimicry, but in its own raw, broken voice, something deep inside, its chest-shaping sound and demeaning. The commander stood frozen, the rifle slipping from his grasp as if the weight of it no longer belonged to him. The soldiers stared in disbelief, but she did not seem surprised. Her hand rested gently against the creature's head, her eyes reflecting the low amber glow of its gaze. She knelt before it slowly, as though the air itself had thickened around her. She whispered something too soft for the microphones to catch, and the cub exhaled a slow, trembling breath, its body sinking to the floor in calm surrender. When she looked up, the other cubs had all turned their faces toward her, watching, waiting, every muscle stilled, every sound swallowed into the hum of the room. The commander tried to speak again, his voice shaking as he demanded to know what she was, what kind of experiment had created her. She rose to her feet, her hands sliding from the cub's muzzle, and for a moment, the quiet seemed to bend around her. She said, "I was never created. I was chosen." And her voice, though soft, carried across the hall without echo, the words threading through every wire and every heart that heard them. The commander staggered backward, whispering about containment protocols and threats to human command, but the soldiers did not move. None of them could. Their eyes locked on her, and the creatures who waited with the stillness of devotion. The youngest cub stepped forward, pressing its paw against the barrier. The glass hissed as the containment field flickered, its glow dimming for a fraction of a second. The commander raised his weapon in panic, and in that same moment the cubs reacted, not with violence, but with sound, a deep resonance that rolled through the air like thunder without Storm, the weapon slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. He fell to his knees, covering his ears as the hum filled every corner of the chamber. She stepped toward him, her expression unreadable. She said, "They were never yours to control. They were only waiting for someone to listen." Her words cut through the sound, and as quickly as it had risen, the hum faded. The cubs exhaled in unison, their eyes dimming to a soft glow like embers before sleep. When the emergency lights finally steadied, the commander looked up and she was gone, the door to the pen standing open, the cubs inside resting their heads together, calm and silent. The monitor showed no trace of her heat signature. Beyond the room, only the faint rhythm of heartbeats, too synchronized to belong to separate bodies. Weeks later, the facility was sealed, the reports buried under classified archives, but those who had been there spoke in whispers that sometimes at night near the old research site the forest stirs and golden eyes glint beneath the trees, and a soft voice answers when the wind passes through the leaves, gentle and sure as a promise. "Can I be yours?" No one somewhere, the wild replies, "You always were."